and you've been taking a look at the fair and reciprocal plan. So the White House. What are you watching?
Well, the report I gave last week, good day, guys, and listeners and viewers. The report I gave last week, and let's get that first slide up there, dealt with the White House's issuance of the reciprocal plan. And on 13 February, President Donald Trump signed a presidential memorandum ordering the development of a comprehensive plan for restoring what he calls fairness in U.S. trade relationships and countering non-reciprocal trading arrangements. And that plan seeks to correct longstanding imbalances in international trade and ensure fairness across the board. That part is in red for emphasis. And moving on from there, the EU's trade representative, their trade commissioner, made a American Enterprise Institute AEI visit, and that's this slide here. I covered it in real time and took some slides or some screenshots rather that are basically the same thing as photos as if you were there in person. Excuse me. And so that was the 19th of February, that program a couple of days ago. And this notation from AEI, a very active think tank in Think Tank Row there in DC along Massachusetts Avenue, where many of the major think tanks are located. The second Trump administration, they say, has announced and threatened to enact a range of disruptive and broadly protectionist trade policy changes as America's allies and trading partners consider their response. Uncertainty reigns. And then AEI welcomed Maros Sefcovic, the European Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security, for a conversation that day, this past Wednesday. And it was in the morning. And later that day, he went to meet with Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, the newly seated one under Trump, and some other officials. This shows the main program presenters at the AEI program Wednesday. Maros Sefcovic, the EU Trade Commissioner, is shown there to the left, and he was interviewed by Senior Fellow for AEI, Stan Voiger. And we can move on from there. And this is the world trade according to Maros Sefcovic. And what I'm pointing out here happens to comport pretty well with what we were saying earlier today on the news. Just as the U.S. and Europe are at odds over Ukraine, the U.S. and the EU are definitely at odds over trade. And it's really two worlds colliding. It's two philosophies. And this is what the mainstream press, the mass media cartel, just does not report. That it's not a question so much of reaching an agreement on the EU conventional free trade terms, the conventional free trade philosophy. The U.S. is seeking a different construct, a different system, a different philosophy. And that's what I'm clarifying. Now, on this one, the EU, let's go back to that slide there because that's the main point. That one there. This is what Sefcovic had to say. These were his main points. The EU is built on free trade among its members. Opening up the world's trade is deeply embedded in the EU's DNA, he says. And he called it the world's largest trading bloc with free trade agreements with 76 countries. 72 of those leading trade countries account for 38% of the global GDP. The US-EU relationship, economic relationship, he said, is the largest in the world. He called it a win-win partnership. Boeing and Airbus are made in the US, but with cutting-edge electronic power systems and fuselages made in the EU. US semiconductor production, he said, depends on EU-made lithography machines. And U.S. battle tanks and armored fighting vehicles, he said, rely on EU-made drivetrains and cannons. And, quote, even the U.S. Mint, get this, uses EU-made high-tech printing machines to print U.S. dollars and prevent counterfeiting. Now, what needs to be pointed out there is the Trump trade philosophy is such where the U.S. would make its own components for printing U.S. dollars. It would make its own components, drivetrains for U.S. military vehicles, and whatever is lacking in U.S. production for Airbus and Boeing and things like that, they would be made primarily in U.S. factories. In other words, the U.S., by all indications, is seeking to manufacture the very things that the EU is making right now. That's the divergence in philosophy. The U.S. is going, apparently, all indications, the U.S. is going for a more self-sufficient nationalistic approach in major manufacturing. So Sefcovic, I think, is looking for something that the U.S. just isn't wholly pursuing. Now, the next day, the Associated Press noted, and I won't read all of this, that hoping to head off a potential trade conflict, the top European trade official, Sefcovic, stressed the importance of active engagement and fairness in a 4-hour meeting with Trump administration officials. And that was later that day after he met with the AEI. He met with the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, the White House National Economic Council Director, Kevin Hassett, and Jameson Greer, President Donald Trump's nominee to be the U.S. trade representative. And apparently he has not been seated in that position yet. Reuters also reported a little bit on this one. I marked in lighter, more bold letters the main part of it. Sefcovic speaking to reporters after meetings on Wednesday with Trump's top trade officials said he saw some willingness on the part of the U.S. to mutually reduce tariffs. But again, I think what he's missing there is that the U.S., again, is pursuing a different systematic or systemic approach. The U.S. wants to replace some of the internal tax revenue with external tax revenue to have the external revenue service more than the internal revenue service, as I've reported on here. So the U.S. wants to raise tariffs, not so much to punish other countries, although some of that will happen sort of as a unavoidable effect, but to actually use that as a source of revenue. Meanwhile, the EU is saying it has almost zero tariffs on something like 70% of its imports into the European Union, which means they're generating almost no revenue with tariffs. So what we're seeing here is just a two worlds colliding, Brian. It's two philosophies, and the AEI think tank and the media is trying to make everything. They're trying to break everything to the saddle or make everything comport to the conventional free trade philosophy that the EU is following, which is the global world trade system that the WTO wants. And that's the one that the Council on Foreign Relations, the major think tanks support. But the US is simply going a different direction. And these other interests and these other actors in this issue are just not acknowledging it. And that's the sum and substance of what's going on, Brian.
It is amazing times with the scale of the differences now appearing. Part of me says we need to watch this very carefully, because much as we've seen the tit for tat politics going on in both in UK between Labour and Conservatives, we're also seeing that has happened in America. Are we now seeing that same tit for tat, yaboo politics happening on a global scale to keep the wider public's eye off the steady movement towards a one world government system, a rules-based international order? I think a lot of care needed at the moment as we look at what's unfolding. Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, Brian, what Mark has just shown you there is it signals an end to the post-World War II peace dividend. So where the U.S. used to basically provide defense for Europe and allow open U.S. markets for German products and so forth for the rebuilding and the lifting up of Europe, that's over. Now they're competitors. Now you're in a different situation. And the U.S. has to be careful on this, because they risk Europe facing east. Now, that might not be a bad thing for a lot of people, but the U.S. might come to regret it. So there's pluses and minuses with this change of strategy from Washington. We shall see.
We will see. Well, if you like what the UK column does and you like our news reporting and articles, then please do support us. We rely on your donations and, of course, memberships. And a commitment to the UK column are very important for us. You can do that on a monthly basis or an annual subscription, or you can become a lifetime member, as many people have. You can help us by making a purchase through the UK column shop. And as we always like to point out, that we are able to take a small percentage from health products from Clive to Carl. So if health is your thing, have a look at that on the UK Column website. Now, we do what we do to inform, to get out facts and information and as much truth as we can. What we'd like from our audience is to see people sharing the material. We are still blocked on some of these channels, but if you can share and acknowledge UK Column as a source, we're extremely grateful. Now, UK Column on location coming up Saturday, the 5th of April 2025. You've got a signpost to help you find the event on screen. We're delighted to have some really top speakers and indeed some old faces back with us. So Patrick, you're there alongside Alex Thompson, Catherine Gunn, more names to be released very soon, but I'm sure it's going to be a very, very interesting event. Yep. And I'd just like to remind people that I've started to put out what will be a series of cases about child stealing by the UK state. I know these interviews are very emotional, but if we cannot protect children and we cannot protect our own families from the state, we are in a very, very dangerous position in this country, never mind what is happening between Trump and Ukraine and the European Union. How do we challenge what's happening? Well, that's standing up to be counted. And I want to say that, of course, Public Child Protection Wales, the men and women and men who've been involved in that have done an absolutely fantastic job. 22nd of February, they've got a conference coming up, and that'll be near Newport in South Wales. So have a look at the website. We've also got the Scottish People's COVID-19 inquiry, Saturday, the 22nd of February, Lauriston Hall, 28 Lauriston Street, Edinburgh, EH3 9DJ. That's £25 for an all-day event. More people standing up to be counted and challenging the system, and this is so important. And then finally here we've got Sunday, March the 16th, 10 a.m. till 6. We've got the event supporting farmers for food security symposium. So this is very, very important for all of us. And if you're local or can travel, please do go and support that. Now, we're